Welcome to our Peace Dividend interview series, inviting some of the nation's most respected thought leaders to offer an objective look at U.S. foreign policy. Today, we are honored to have with us the distinguished, highly respected William J. Astore. He is a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, has taught at the Air Force Academy and Naval Postgraduate School, and now teaches history at Pennsylvania College of Technology. He is a senior fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network, an organization of critical veteran military and national security professionals. He is the author or co-author of 3 books and numerous articles focusing on military history, as well as the history of science, technology, and religion. I read everything that he ever publishes. His writing is absolutely fantastic. Welcome, Bill. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, John, for that nice invitation. And there's no higher compliment you can pay an author than actually reading what he writes. So thank you for that as well.
I know it's a bold move on my part, that's for sure. Today's interview focuses on 5 questions. World events continue to unfold at a quickening pace. Facing an alarming escalation in tensions around the world, we look to Bill for his most current thoughts. As I've indicated before, we're focusing on the realities of the international power struggle unfolding in real time, specifically addressing the role of the U.S. in the tensions and its capacity to reduce them. We hope to discover paradigm shift ideas for improving the prospects for peace. Shall we get started?
Sure.
First question. We hear a lot of terms and acronyms bandied about: deep state, MIC, fire sector, ruling elite, oligarchy, neocons. Who actually defines and sets America's geopolitical priorities and determines our foreign policy? Not officially, not constitutionally, but de facto.
Right. Well, you may see behind me here, I have my I Like Ike sticker that a friend of mine picked up in Gettysburg. And I do quote Dwight D. Eisenhower quite a bit in my writings because as you know, John, in 1961, he gave his famous farewell address where he warned us all of the dangers of the misplaced power of the military industrial complex. And into the MIC, we have to add Congress as well, as Eisenhower wanted to do in the speech, but he was talked out of it. He wanted to go out on better terms with Congress. So when we take a look at the military industrial complex in America, we see something that's very powerful. We see a complex that has a budget this year of $858 billion, which is actually $45 billion more than the Biden administration requested. So, Congress went ahead and just added an extra 45 billion, just kind of for the fun of it, in the sense of, they're sort of hankering for another new Cold War with China as well as Russia. So that the power of the complex is immense. And it's worth contrasting that with the State Department's budget. So in theory, we're supposed to have a State Department that's in charge of foreign policy as well as the President, National Security Council, and all that. But the Pentagon's budget is roughly 14 times that of the State Department's budget, which is roughly about 60 billion a year. So when you look at that power comparison between those 2 budgets, you see who really is calling the shots. So again, I come at this as a retired military officer and also as a historian. But if we the people were in command or had some kind of say in foreign policy, there would be a lot fewer wars. The Pentagon budget would be a lot lower, and yet that's not the case. In fact, I think when we take a look at history, this is, I think Americans tend to forget this, that the last declared war that we had in this country was World War II. in 1941 when FDR went ahead and asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. And that's a key point. We are supposed to conduct foreign policy, and the most really life and death thing that we can do as a nation is to wage war. And yet, even those decisions, even the most vital decisions on sending our troops off into combat to fight and die, allegedly in defense of the US Constitution, is something we no longer do as a country. It's been taken out of our hands. So we fought wars in Korea and Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan. We fought these wars without the consent of the governed. And you have to ask yourself then, who is really calling the shots? And I would come back to the corporations in America, the military industrial complex, whether you want to call it an oligarchy or the deep state, I think that's where we're really seeing, the power dynamic being exercised in our country.
We've had decades of international tensions. Recent developments have seen a sharp escalation in the potential for another major war. The U.S. apparently can't be at peace. Threats against the homeland are allegedly increasing in number and severity. The trajectory of our relations with the rest of the world appears to be more confrontations, more enemies, more crises, more wars. Is the world really full of aggressors, bad actors, ruthless opponents? Or is there something in our own policies and attitudes toward other countries which puts us at odds with them, thus making war inevitable and peace impossible?
Yeah. Well, there's always bad actors, John, but when we look at the world, we need to think that there aren't only bad actors outside the United States. We have our own series of bad actors in our history. So, I think, unfortunately, I don't think peace. I don't want to say that peace is impossible. I don't think that war is inevitable. But unfortunately, war is very profitable. And this is something that a very famous American Marine by the name of Smedley Butler, he was a general. He wrote a famous book called War is a Racket. And he should know, he served in the Marine Corps, and as he said himself, he served as in uniform as a gangster for capitalism. This was he said this in the 1930s, and there's still a lot of truth to that today. What we as Americans were seeking to do back in the 1930s, at least in part, was to take the profit out of war. This is what Smedley Butler said, that if we want to try to put an end to war, we have to make it so that war is not profitable, that we don't have mega corporations making hundreds of billions of dollars off of war. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to do that. And so, war is something that a lot of people make a lot of money off of, number one. But secondly, the other point I would make is something that Chris Hedges has written about. And that is that in the United States, we are a violent country. And as Hedges said in his book, war is a force that gives us meaning as a people. And so what we have in America since World War II is that we have a more or less permanent war economy. And it's very difficult to overcome that. When I was in the military, I was an Air Force captain in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And we were all talking about that sign that's right behind you that says a peace dividend. And we were all saying, the big enemy is defeated. We're finally going to be able to cash in on our peace dividends as a country. Gene Kirkpatrick, who is one of the original neocons under Ronald Reagan, talked about America becoming a normal country in normal times. But that didn't happen. It's like, for a brief period, Pentagon spending was flat, and then all of a sudden it picked up again. And then, of course, right after the 9/11 attacks, in our misbegotten war on terror and the catastrophic, wars of choice, wars of very bad choice in Iraq and Afghanistan, there went the peace dividend, and we've been more or less in a state of permanent war since then. So, peace is something we can achieve as a people. We tried to do this in the 1930s. We had a lot of insights then from people like Butler, who said, look, we've got to get the profit out of war. We had Senate hearings, the Nye Commission, that investigated arms merchants and actually called them merchants of death. But nowadays, we in the United States, we celebrate the stock market, we celebrate Wall Street, and we celebrate the fact that corporations like Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and all the rest are making tons of money off of sending weaponry to Ukraine, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and other war zones around the world. In fact, we remain the world's #1 arms exporters. No other country comes close to our market dominance as far as selling weaponry.
Our leaders relentlessly talk about our national interests and our national security, warning that both are under constant assault. Yet we spend more than the next 9 countries combined on our military. Why does such colossal spending never seem to be enough?
Yeah. Well, one reason is threat inflation, right? I mean, this is something that I saw when I was in the Air Force, in the military. We had this whole belief that the Soviet Union was this colossus that we had to spend enormous sums of money to defeat. And so, for example, even though the United States had but let's take the nuclear triad. Our submarines were far quieter than the Soviet ones, much easier to locate them if we had to and destroy them. Our bomber force was more powerful. Our ICBMs were much more accurate. And yet, we were always exaggerating the Soviet threat. I remember seeing the old magazines back then, the slick ones that would show the Soviet missiles were bigger than ours and with bigger warheads. And so we had sort of like a missile envy. I remember Dr. Helen Caldecott wrote a famous book called, Missile Envy, kind of on the whole idea of penis envy, because the Soviet missiles were always shown as being much bigger than ours. The reason why they were is because they were much less accurate than ours. And the Soviets had to have, much bigger warheads just to have a ghost of a chance of wiping out, where the missiles were going. But anyway, so we overhyped the Soviet threat. And what's really rather surprising when you think about it was a huge failure of our intelligence agencies in the 1980s, who were still saying that basically the Soviet Union was going to exist for the next 50 years and maybe forever. And then all of a sudden, within 5, 6, 7 years, the Soviet Union came crashing down. So when I look historically, we've always exaggerated the threat that we faced. So you remember the bomber gap from the 1950s and the missile gap from Kennedy's administration. We've always tended to exaggerate the threats that we face, and that this is used as a reason for why we have to keep spending larger and larger sums on defense, when in fact, let's face it, our country is not structured. Our military is not structured for defense. It's structured for offense. And this is what we talk about in the Air Force. As an Air Force officer, my vision, the vision of my service, was global reach, global power, global vigilance. The emphasis on the globe and domination. We talked openly of full spectrum dominance. We have 750 military bases around the world to ensure that we keep that dominance. So we really need to talk about, to just say things truthfully, that the United States is an empire. And that's why our defense budget is really an imperial budget of offense, an imperial budget of dominance, in which we also exaggerate the threats that we face so that those in the Pentagon can ensure that their power is secure by having the largest budget possible.
It's evident that you and the many individuals who follow you and support your work believe that America's direction in both the diplomatic sphere and the current conflict zones represents exercise of government power gone awry. Can you paint for us in broad strokes the specific changes in our national priorities and policies you view as necessary for the U.S. to peacefully coexist with other nations, at the same time keeping us safe from malicious attacks on our security and rightful place in the world community?
Right, right. Well, I'm gonna make a big bold statement. The first step is to cut the Pentagon budget in half. Now, whether you do that in one fell swoop, which I know is highly unlikely, or you do it over the next 10 years or so, which is maybe possible. It has to be done. It absolutely has to be done, because I am convinced that the military industrial complex will never, ever shrink itself, right? It continues to grow. So the only way you can cut it is to cut off its lifeblood, which is money. So that's really the first step is making major cuts to military budget. I mean, the second step as Americans is getting control over our government again. And that is going to have to involve a major effort at campaign finance reform. Because right now, sadly, Congress is pretty much bought off. There was a study a few years ago, the Princeton study, basically taking a look at how much say Americans actually have, I mean, ordinary Americans actually have on what passes, through Congress, what our government does. And the answer is virtually none. That's not surprising. With the Citizens United decision that the Supreme Court passed about a dozen years ago now, and that only made matters worse, because it basically said corporations have the same, free speech rights as ordinary people like you and me, except they have billions of votes and we have just one. And by billions, of course, I'm talking about all the money that they have, all the campaign contributions that they make, and so on. The other part of it, though, is also changing our culture, right? So right now we have a media, mainstream media, that's owned by corporations, and that basically tries to convince us to always be fearful, always be afraid. And as Frank Herbert said in Dune, both the book and now the movie, fear is the mind killer. Fear paralyzes thought. So instead of trying to work toward peace, we're not very effective at doing that because we're always paralyzed by fear. We're always told to fear China, fear Russia, fear some terrorist organization, fear Iran, or whatever other enemy of the day. This is something that we must, America is supposed to be land of the free, home of the brave. And last time I checked, brave people aren't supposed to be fearing their shadows.
So here's the last question. This is the most important and certainly the most difficult. The general public, especially when it's aware of the self-sabotaging results of our current foreign policies and military posturing, clearly wants less war and militarism, preferring more peaceful alternatives on the world stage and greater concentration on solving the problems at home. As peace activists, we are thus more in line with the majority of citizens on issues of war and peace than those currently in power. What happens, Bill, If we determine that those shaping current U.S. policy don't care what the citizenry thinks, are simply not listening to us? What if we conclude that our Congress, for example, is completely deaf to the voice of the people? What do we do? What are our options then? What are our next concrete steps as political activists in working toward a peaceful future? As a thought leader and advocate of dramatic reform bill, what do you propose?
Yeah, wow. Um, that's a difficult question, and people have asked me that question before. Sometimes they phrase it as, what can I do, right? They'll ask me, what can I do? And on the personal level, my answer is we can only do what we can, right? And so I tell people to work toward their strengths. I served in the military for 20 years. I'm a historian. I have the academic credentials. I have a little bit of military cred to go with it. And so I write as much as I can. I talk to people like yourself, people like you, who are also feel passionately that we are off course and we need to, there's a better path ahead for America. And so, whatever your talents are, uh, get out there and try to effect change. The problem is, to be honest, we're up against very powerful forces. I have been studying and writing against the military-industrial complex since the early 1980s. And so for 40 years, my record, if I had to, I guess it's been a record of failure, right? In the sense that the military-industrial complex only grows stronger. So what can we do? I think, we need to get out into the streets again. I mean, during the Vietnam War, the anti-war protesters were actually able to move the needle against the Vietnam War because they were willing to take a stand and they were willing to sacrifice. But to be honest, it's become more difficult to do that in the United States because our police forces are now more heavily militarized than they've ever been. It's more dangerous to take to the streets as a result. And Americans in general are not as well informed as we used to be during the Vietnam War period. So I guess I come back to Ike. I come back to the words of Dwight D. Eisenhower when he said that only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can help guard against the acquisition of power, whether sought or unsought, and is most definitely sought by the military-industrial complex. So it really comes down to you and me and everyone else listening to this. We have to be those alert and knowledgeable citizens, and we need to be willing to challenge Congress. We need to be willing to vote and support, political candidates who are actually much more in tune with our priorities. So, for example, in the last election, I supported Matthew Hoh for his run for the Senate in North Carolina. He's a Green Party candidate, but Matt Hoh, he was a Marine Corps veteran. He also was in the State Department, and he resigned from the State Department in protest against the Afghan war and the Afghan surge that, because he was there, he knew was going to fail. He could see it failing. And so we need to support candidates like him. You can't just vote for the usual suspects, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. If Democrats and Republicans, basically every year, the Pentagon budget has and enjoys strong bipartisan support. When that budget went up $45 billion, it was with strong bipartisan support by Congress. So we need to vote the warmongers out and vote people like Matt Hoh in. And I know that's extremely difficult to do. The challenge to third-party candidates is they have a difficult challenge to surmount. But unless we throw our weight behind candidates like that, nothing is going to change. So we need to work through the political process. We need to work outside the political process. But ultimately, we need to remember that, in a way, we're citizens. The government wants us to forget that we're citizens. They don't want to, they want to isolate us from war. They don't want to tell us what's happening. So the number one thing we can all do is to become more alert and knowledgeable. And then we need to act together as a people. We need to be citizens united again. And what I don't mean the corporations with their free speech. I mean all of us coming together in the spirit of those Vietnam War and the Vietnam War protesters, and actually getting out there and working to make the world a much more of a world that you and I want to see, John. And that's one where peace takes the place of war.
Very powerful words, Bill. Thank you. That concludes our interview. Again, thank you, Bill, for taking the time to share your courageous, thoughtful, and powerful insights with us. And by the way, folks, if you want more of this kind of excellent analysis and commentary, I encourage you to visit William J. Astore's personal blog site, Bracing Views. And what is the URL for that site?
Oh, right. It's bracingviews.substack.com. And of course, as you know, John, I write a lot for TomDispatch.com as well. And I urge anyone listening to this, if you haven't checked out Tom Dispatch, as some of the best writers writing on current affairs today. People like Andy Basovich and Alfred McCoy and Nick Turse and all the rest. Lots of people writing in an informed way, trying to change the world and move it in a much more peaceful direction.
Michael Clare appears
Michael
on
Clare, absolutely. Yeah, he's written as many as I have, I think.
And by the way, Tom Dispatch is where I read all of your stuff. But Bill's material then is reprinted elsewhere, so keep your eye out for it. Listen, I want to sincerely thank all of you out there who are watching this and make one last request. Please visit and spend some time on the Peace Dividend website. The Peace Dividend strategy is a way to directly confront the imperial establishment, the war machine. Never give up hope and keep spreading the truth. Peace. Thank you and good day.
Thank you, John.